Hi everybody. Today we're going to be talking about, or continue talking about biodiversity and how humans have limited the amount of biodiversity on the planet. Let's start off with the greenhouse effect. The greenhouse effect is when gases like carbon dioxide, water vapor, and methane build up in our atmosphere. And what these gases do is they trap in some of the sun's energy. Right? And it's kind of like this little blanket that surrounds the earth. Right? Now, this is a natural process, and it's actually a good process because it keeps the climate on Earth, suitable for life, right? It's like this little blanket surrounding the Earth, and it keeps everything nice and warm and the temperature where it should be for living organisms. However, we have global warming and climate change when human activity increases the amount of greenhouse gases in our atmosphere. So doing things like burning fossil fuels, oil and coal, all add carbon dioxide, CO2 to our atmosphere. Right? The cattle industry adds more methane to our atmosphere. All these gases, they build up. Right? And that blanket that kept us warm now gets thicker and thicker and thicker, right? So now we trap in more of the sun's energy, and that's why the average global temperature is increasing over time because of buildup of these greenhouse gases due to human activities. Now, a slight change in temperature can have dramatic effects on the environment. Now, we know that it changes how plants grow, and it changes the migration patterns of birds. It has all these unintended consequences. Another one of these unintended consequences is the rise of sea level. So, the sea is currently rising on average about 3 millimeters per year. Again, the cause of this is global warming, that increase in temperature due to the greenhouse effect. Now, what's happening is that the rise in temperature is causing the glaciers and ice sheets found on land to melt, right? And as they melt, all that fresh water gets added to the ocean. Also, we see the top layer of the ocean is a little bit warmer than it used to be, and the warming of water causes it to expand. These, again, it seems like 3 millimeters a year of sea level rise is not a big deal, but we found that it has large consequences, right? So we saw that it leads to an increase in coastal erosion. There is more salt water intruding into land, killing off plants. It changes the currents. It changes, where the plankton is found, how deep it is in the ocean, which affects the entire food chain. So there's lots of unintended consequences for this sea level rise. While we're talking about our seas and oceans and some of the things that we've done to limit biodiversity there, we can also talk about pollution. Pollution is the addition of substances, objects, or noise that can be harmful to the ecosystem. And again, small concentrations of pollutants have big effects on our environment. So in the 1940s, the United States was spraying this chemical called DDT. And DDT, we found, is really good at killing insects like mosquitoes, which, is good for preventing malaria. But by the time, the 1950s and 60s rolled around, we realized that DDT is not very good stuff for humans, and, it's not very good stuff for the animals in the ecosystem, but we've already sprayed a ton of it. So the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, went out and they tested the water, right? And they found that in the water, there's a very, very small concentration, about 1 part per million, of this DDT in our water. And okay, everybody relax. There's not enough DDT in the water to cause any harm. However, what happens is that even though the DDT in the water and the environment is very, very low, there's something called biomagnification. And biomagnification is just the increase of harmful substances as you go up the food chain. So by the time we test the producers, like the algae that lives in this water, we found that the amount of DDT increased about 1,000 parts per million. And then the zooplankton has about 10,000 parts per million. The small fish have about 100 parts per thousand DDT. The reason is because like the small fish eat the zooplankton. Every time a small fish eats a piece of zooplankton, they get a little dose of this DDT toxin. And then that small fish is eaten by the larger fish. Right? So that larger fish gets a little bit more of the DDT from the small fish. Right? And then that large fish is eventually eaten by the apex predator, which happens to be these birds right here. So every time the bird eats a fish, it gets a little dose of poison, and that poison kind of collects in the fatty tissues of that bird, and eventually you found that it almost wiped out many bird populations because the DDT affected the shells that the birds would lay around their eggs. So birds were laying eggs with very, very, very weak shells, and none of the baby birds were surviving. So again, small changes in the environment, just like a little bit of DDT in the water down here, had big consequences for the birds up here. The last thing I want to talk about is a process called eutrophication. And eutrophication starts off with nitrogen fertilizer that farmers spray on the field doesn't always stay on the fields. After it rains, that nitrogen fertilizer ends up in the ocean. Instead of making our crops grow on land, that fertilizer makes algae grow in the ocean. And that seems like a good thing, right? That you have more algae growing in the ecosystem. That's the bottom of the food chain. That means more food for everybody else. But as soon as that fertilizer is all used up, this abundance of algae, this algae bloom, dies off, right? And as it dies, it decomposes. So now the bacteria is breaking down all of this algae, and that bacteria is sucking the oxygen out of the water. And now there's no oxygen left for the fish and the crabs and the starfish and all the other animals of the ecosystem. So eventually all of these guys die due to a lack of oxygen. And what you find here is like these big dead spots in the ocean where nothing survives because there's no oxygen left in the water. Alright guys, that's it for today's lesson. Thank you.